Okay, so I just finished talking to Dr. James Cooke, and I cannot wait to share this on with you guys. I had a fascinating conversation with James. For those of you who don't know, James is primarily a neuroscientist. He has his PhD in neuroscience from Oxford. He's a speaker and writer on things like perception, well-being, consciousness. He's got an interest in the spiritual side of things and psychedelics. So we talk about a whole load of things in here. As you can see from the video, James is just a fascinating guy, very interesting, very intelligent, very humble, explains his ideas in an extremely clear way. I'd strongly recommend everyone to go and check out his YouTube channel. I've got a link to it on the homepage of my channel, but I'll put one in the description below. Go and check out some of the stuff. I've absolutely had my mind blown watching a few of his videos. So as you can see, we throw everything at this conversation. We go from psychedelics to sort of religious experiences. We talk about how the brain models reality. We go across a whole lot of different subjects, and it was just an awesome conversation. I also put to him some questions that I got from Reddit. I actually got a lot more questions from Reddit than I expected. So what I had to do is kind of like merge them together and sort of more generalize them, because there just wasn't time to get through all of them. So apologies if I didn't get to your question. There were just so many, but I did my best with what I could do there. Anyway, enough waffling from me. Check out this conversation with James. I love it. Thanks a lot, guys. And thanks a lot to James for your time. It was awesome to speak to you, and I can't wait to do it again. So without further ado, Dr. James Cooke. So I'm on the line with Dr. James Cooke, and James, like I said, it's a real pleasure to get to talk to you. I'm a huge fan. But for those of my audience who might not have come across you before, maybe you just want to introduce yourself in your own words. Who is Dr. James Cooke?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm a big fan of you as well, so it's nice to finally connect.
Cheers, mate.
So I'm a doctor in the sense of PhD, so not a medical doctor, but I do research into the brain, into kind of neuroscience, and specifically kind of perception, how the brain kind of structures conscious experience. And obviously you might be able to see from that why I might be interested in psychedelics as well. It's a kind of another research interest of mine. But I'm also someone who, I meditate. I have a kind of history of from quite a young age being interested in spiritual matters. So I'm kind of find myself being frustrated by the way that certain kind of spiritual things aren't seen as mainstream, and especially in sciences. If you say you meditate, people kind of assume you're trying to levitate or something, supernatural, and they don't talk to you about it anymore. So I kind of, for a long time, had this yearning to try and lay out a picture of how I think the natural world is in a way that you can say, this is why paying attention in meditation can lead to profound insights into the nature of reality, and it fits with neuroscience, it fits with biology, it fits with everything, and it, in a way that it's still profound. It's not a way that reduces it and makes it kind of go away, So I'm fundamentally, in my day job, I'm a neuroscientist, but my real passion, I would say, is trying to draw these links between science and spirituality.
Mm-hmm. And I think I just want to add on to that is that, so part of the how I came across you is that you also have this YouTube channel, where you sort of post regular videos like every week or something, where you really do an excellent job of just breaking down these topics on consciousness and perception, really, in a way that's very, very digestible. And as I mentioned, that's how I came across your stuff. And I wanted to sort of talk about just what you mentioned there, in that you I think do a really good job of straddling between these different spaces of this academic, the sort of the hard science, also this kind of spiritual element, what's it like being across those two spaces? Because I've seen, we inhabit a few of the same places online in sort of subreddits and things like that, and I think I share your frustrations in that there's something here, there's something going, there is something is happening. It needs to be talked about in some kind of way, but as soon as you go there, then you get this almost, I hate to say it because I do feel like I lean more towards the science side, but there seems to be something like there's a religion of science almost, where as soon as you say something like,
definitely,
then it's like, oh, this is woo, this is bullshit, and so how do you find, particularly within your professional space, how do you do that? How do you go across those two realms and still have validity in each?
It's an interesting question, and I would say I'm fairly new to it, and I'm still figuring it out. For a long time, I would say I was pretty much in the closet when it came to kind of spiritual stuff. I just kind of didn't talk to people at work about it because I assumed they wouldn't, be interested or know what I'm talking about.
Is it the same? Is there still like a kind of taboo over it? In
I think so.
Particularly when
it's also
with sort of psychedelics, where you're talking about potentially something that could or possibly be illegal. What does that kind of look like? And
yeah, so I think in academic spaces, it's people are aware there's research going on in neuroscience. People intuitively grasp that these are interesting compounds, and I've definitely been in situations where the head of my department, I'll give a talk on serotonin and talk about LSD and stuff like that, and get a question from the head of the department being like, well, of course LSD has these kinds of effects, not, and in a way where they're not shying away from the fact that they've had experience with it. Right. So you do get that occasionally, but I would say generally, like when I started my YouTube channel, I heard from a close friend of mine at work that a few other colleagues had just inquired after my well-being, basically my mental health, because for the first time talking about these things, they're like, oh, has James gone insane? He's now he's talking as if reality or like life might be meaningful and profound, so that's mapped onto some kind of mental illness rather than perhaps there's something going on here to be inquired into,
Isn't that bizarre though, that it's something, it seemed to be like a positive thing and a creative output, but yet it's instantly mapped onto it being something to be concerned about.
Exactly. I mean, you've got to imagine a space of where people are interested in it's a very ego-based space, I guess. I guess science, and so. But yeah, I agree. The idea that you could be like, this person, they seem to be talking a lot about love, and they seem to be talking a lot about being aware and conscious. They must be like, that's something strange that we don't want anything to do with, that's mental illness. So at the moment, it's in the science space, I tend to keep them quite separate, but I'm also aware, part of what I'm trying to do is show a way of being a scientist or someone who's explicitly scientifically minded, but doesn't dismiss this stuff and doesn't, who gets the kind of importance of this stuff. Because the way that I see it is the current scientific mainstream, most people have the impression that nihilism is what's true, basically, that, you're in this big empty universe and it's scary and life's meaningless and you die and there's nothing after. And that narrative is that's taken often to be what science says, right?
Yeah.
But if you understand the psychology that the ego is a construct, and that actually fundamentally you're not this scared little ego that evolved fear, just as an evolutionary trick to keep it alive. That's the only reason you feel like a scared little ego, like Nietzsche was really not onto something when he said, that all this kind of get rid of all the spiritual stuff, get rid of all the religion. There's genuine, a scientific worldview is, I would say, is equivalent to the mystical worldview. Like science in the best hands of people like Carl Sagan, like these very inspirational scientists, they get, I think, a lot of the time that science is the modern language of mysticism. You can point to the vastness of space and you can have these experiences of kind of transcendent awe, and they're real. They're taking you closer to the way reality is. They're not like hallucinations or fantasies or wishful thinking. So I think when I kind of am in the more spiritual spaces, I'm at pains to, I worry, that people might think, oh, here comes a scientist. He's going to think this is all just some kind of hallucination. This is all, to be reduced and to be explained away. And so I'm really trying to put forward a way that you can be scientifically rigorous and be spiritual. And actually, I would argue that's a better partnership than being a nihilist and being a scientist. That has unexamined assumptions, basically, that spiritual stuff doesn't.
Yeah, I think it seems like that boundary is very, very fluid at the moment. It seemed, if I think back, say, I don't know, my dates are a bit fuzzy, but maybe 15 years ago when like the God delusion was huge and there was this very big sort of like new atheistic movement, and it seemed like everyone was on board with this, like, yeah, life begins, life ends, done, close the book, it's all good. And now when we interestingly, that one of those guys who was behind that was Sam Harris, who I'm a big fan of, but he's also now much more prominent in this kind of, talking about meditation stuff. And so that the line of science where it used to be like this closed book seems to be moving a little bit more into this kind of, well, actually there is a human experience and we should talk about this. And there is this, there is something to this meditation. It's not all just kind of woo. So there's almost like a hopeful, from an outsider anyway, there seems like this hopeful movement of science into, sort of this new frontier. But there's still, which I think we've come across in some of the online spaces, there's still these guys who are like just absolutely, no, if you're gonna, as soon as you start using any poetic or fluffy language, you're full of shit.
Yeah.
So I suppose for what you're doing with your work and your research, is there some kind of like hard? Is there a point at which you say if you cross that line, then that's the blacklist, or that's the cliff that you commit suicide on?
That's interesting. I actually I've been doing some work on consciousness and like the hard problem of consciousness. And a colleague of mine, joked when I explained the theory to him that you're supposed to do that after you've won your Nobel Prize, which is a reference to Francis Crick, who co-discovered structure of DNA and then went on to study consciousness, because the idea being that you don't want to be, damaging your career by messing around with something as woo-woo as consciousness. But I think that's changing. Francis Crick, and during that time, there was a real, it really was a kind of, seen as a taboo subject because there was so little grasp of what the problem was. Yeah. But now, a lot of good philosophical work has been done. There's a lot of, talk these days, new theories, panpsychism, that kind of thing. So it's on firmer footing now, than it used to be. So I wouldn't say science is kind of has anything where you're that's kind of taboo and you're blacklisted, But I do think psychedelics have really had to fight for this. I feel like if you were to try to, I think even just trying to get grants for psychedelic research is still, I think to people like us in the spaces we operate, we can see what a transformation's happened, how much momentum there is. There are these centers opening, there's lots of funding comparatively to what there used to be, but it's a drop in the ocean compared to mainstream science funding. It's still fringe. Yeah. But in our lifetime, I think we'll see this snowball, which is also actually to link this with the earlier point we were just discussing. I think the reason it's important to explain and defend spiritual insight from the perspective of science is that in our lifetime, lots of people are going to be having psychedelic experiences as part of just mainstream medicine. If you have PTSD, you might have to have some psychedelic therapy, because that's the only thing that works. It was seen as incurable before psychedelic therapy came along. And people with end of life, suffering with fear of death, with terminal cancer, and then they have these experiences where they're no longer afraid of death because they feel one with the universe. It's important, I think, that we have a kind of map to be able to say what's going on here, because I think a lot of people might just think, well, they'll just presume that what their experience is some kind of hallucination and it's not valid, and that they've just had some kind of fantasy. And that's why it's just, we're going to be forced to have this discussion, I think, publicly. We're going to be, thankfully, just confronted with all these wondrous things that are there under the surface if you confront them through psychedelics or meditation. And that's the other thing, this, the kind of, the way mindfulness is gaining popularity. I'm sure right now there are people vary in how talented, you could say, they are when it comes to things like meditation. And there'll be some people who picked up a meditation app, turned it on, sat down and had some really profound insights, and may not really know what to do with them, may have felt them to be some kind of symptom of some mental health problem or something else. And so that's another reason. There's almost like a really benevolent ticking time bomb when it comes to people discovering the illusoriness of the self is the main thing that they'll discover with both these avenues, I think. But
yeah. I mean, it's definitely. I think. Is it that because the research is sort of still quite new, and there's people talking about it being useful for things like PTSD or depression, but is it that it's just that we've not? Is that still anecdotal evidence? Would you say, or is this kind of finalized that this is actually the cure?
So if I was to use the language of the scientist, what I would say is like there are some very promising preliminary studies, small sample size, but we see statistically significant effects. It's a good signal that we should pursue this, further research. But we live in a situation where science has managed to convince us that it's the only valid way of gaining knowledge, and we've completely dispensed with wisdom. When you look at ayahuasca, what's going on with that? Like, you don't need to do statistics to see the effect it's having on people. Anecdotal evidence is now become a kind of an insult, which is taken to be synonymous with it's not scientifically proven, it can't be true. But I'm a big proponent of believing in wisdom. Like if there's clearly a signal here, and when not only with people personally having experiences on something like ayahuasca, when you look at these studies, I would not describe them as, I would not emphasize the kind of small scale, preliminary, kind of promising, but be careful. This signal is huge. Like, we've never discovered anything that can treat PTSD, and MDMA cures it. Like in most people who have 3 sessions with psychotherapists, it cures it. And like, it's that signal, when I say signal, I'm just talking about, whether or not there's effect there. Could it just be noise, just by chance? So no, I mean, I see it very much that plant medicine in general has been part of the inheritance culturally of all human societies, apart from people who live so far north that there were no plants there. And this is something that has always been with us until the modern world, when it was taken away from us, effectively, largely, a story of kind of domination through religion, of, especially with like conquistadors in Latin America, but also Northern European pagan religions, had all of their plant medicine suppressed by the church. And I think effectively science is now just putting numbers to something that is part of the human experience. It's like it's like doing experiments on running being healthy for you. It's obvious that running can produce weight loss. And if you force 100 people to go for a run so that you can measure how much weight they lose, and then quantify it, great, like that's really good. And we can be more rigorous, and I'm sure we can, discover maybe optimal ways, to administer these things. But no, I see it very much as the science isn't actually that necessary. If I had to say what was more important, I would say a political movement to get these things legalized, or just to make them accessible globally to people, and a community, a kind of a culture where people, can communally kind of help each other to heal, rather than it having to go through this really tightly regimented, scientific system, which is really tied up with the money making of the kind of, pharmaceutical industry, in a way that produces quite unpleasant dynamics that doesn't serve public health so much as profit.
I think also just to have that culture, that cultural change whereby you can talk about these things, because that's, kind of what we were talking about earlier, whereby, if I come into work on Monday and start talking about, some incredibly bizarre psychedelic experience, but then linking it to a positive change, then I'm probably going to get people are going to start looking to lock me up or something. But that's kind of what we do wrong. It's if we can see that there are some good results coming from these things, and it's almost like we have to do that tongue-in-cheek, not talking about the experience that with this incredibly powerful experience. And I'm someone who I have been through one of these kind of transformations myself, because I was the very sort of cut and dried atheist guy we were talking about, and then I ended up in some state where I was having bad panic attacks. The panic attacks were exacerbating my epilepsy, which I have, I was having trouble leaving the house because I thought I was going to die. I was just had this overwhelming fear of death. I thought my kids were going to be like fatherless. It was just building up. And then within a few psychedelic sessions, which I did, I just hadn't touched anything in sort of like over a decade. And then I had like kind of a mystical experience, and that fear of death had just dropped away. Anxiety attacks gone. My sort of epilepsy just dropped right down because it wasn't being exacerbated by the stress. And yeah, and so I'm kind of like I see myself as one of these success stories. But yeah, if I talk about that within the context of the kind of mystical experience, then straight away it's like, well, we didn't really. I mean, you didn't really talk to God. You didn't really. It's like, yeah, all right, I know. Whatever. it worked. What do you want me to say? It's, and I think that's the kind of thing the hardline science crowd need to get away from. Look, something happens here. It works. Like, who gives a shit sort of thing.
I think that's so most of the stuff that my primary interest has always been in a very particular kind of experience, which is this kind of unitive mystical experience of, you might say feeling one with the universe, or, you feel your sense of self drop away and that there's just an unfolding reality, and it's this benevolent, wonderful, liberated space. It's a kind of Buddhist enlightenment type experience, and the core of what I'm passionate about is defending that. And because I basically think if you understand what that experience is and you have that experience, you see that is equivalent to a scientific description of the world, where there's just this unfolding reality, and you are just this witness to this unfolding reality, and you can understand that suffering is built upon suffering is built secondary through evolution, and so you link it up with Buddhist philosophy, and it's true, and it's important because it's all to do with well-being and liberating from suffering. Now there's a secondary interest, which is I just find more fun more than anything as well, which is the stuff you're talking about, the stuff that where you meet entities, and there's stuff that as a scientist I can't. If I were to say that if someone meets an entity that communicates with them, and in the game that I'm trying to play of trying to square these experiences with science, I would have to basically stop that game and say, if these entities are real, our metaphysics needs to change. Like, turns out the science game where we think matter is primary and consciousness is second, turns out that's wrong. Maybe we're in some crazy simulation. Maybe we're in some kind of, maybe the religious metaphysics is true after all, and there's some spirit world, and we come, but at that point, I'm out of my depth, in terms of I don't understand how souls could work, and that kind of, and how immaterial stuff could come into matter, so that leads to an interesting thing, which is the first claim. I want to live in a world where someone could kind of come into the office on Monday and go, oh man, I took mushrooms for the first time, and I realized the wondrous situation we're in, where we're a piece of reality. We're like an eye opening in the universe, we're all just this manifestation of this wonderful underlying situation, and everyone in the office is like, yep, glad you finally realized, mate. It's great, isn't it?
Almost like if you came in and announced like, oh, I got engaged at the weekend, and everyone everyone understands that experience. Oh, well done, mate. That's great. My first child was born. Well done. Oh yeah, I just had my first mystical experience. Whoa, go you!
Exactly, and the person who comes in and they go, oh man, describing the situation you described, where they would say, oh, I don't know, I'm feeling stressed, I'm feeling afraid, I'm feeling fear, panic. And people would know. They would go, there's the brain mechanisms that want to keep you safe they're getting overactive, and they need to be balanced out. You need to be brought over to the more mystical side of things, where you forget, where you relax the fear, you relax all that stuff. And instead of the current situation, which is to take, us being, if we're all left anxious and afraid, most people, a lot of anxiety is, a huge problem these days, right? And we take that as normal. We think that's fine. It makes sense to be anxious. That's an okay kind of situation to be in. So instead of seeing that as there's a problem here, you need to get over to the having the mystical experience kind of thing. But then the other category is exactly what you said, which is if someone comes and they say they had an experience say it's an experience that is like logically impossible. It just like doesn't make any sense at all. Except like it contradicts itself, like, you know, but believing that or having had that experience is beneficial to the person, then yeah, there's an interesting, at that point, I guess is what you're kind of referring to, right? Like, should that person just keep it to themselves, the thing that's, you know, the experience itself, and just focus on the healing side of things? And I'm not really sure. I think we're gonna have to see, you know, you're probably more in tune with this stuff, you know, being kind of linked up with the ayahuasca communities, as to how people work through this kind of stuff and how important it is for them to share these things.
Yeah, well, I mean, I straddle sort of the two spaces myself, because, you know, I definitely, you know, I try and go on retreats like once or twice a year. So I'm kind of dipped in that community, but I also consider myself a fairly average, normal, you know, nuclear family, you know, wife, 2 kids, office job, 9 to 5. So, and that was kind of why I started doing stuff on my channel, is like, what works just for the average Joe like me? What works? Okay, so you can go all in, and, you know, I can grow my dreadlocks and whatever, and sort of, you know, cover myself in patchouli. But what works? And that's what I'm sort of interested in. And so when I get into sort of discussions with people and they say, no, well, is it aliens? Are these entities? Is it aliens, or is it angels, or is it a signal from another dimension? And I'm kind of like, I mean, and I get it sounds a bit flippant, but I don't really give a shit in that aspect. I just care that it works, and that it works for my human experience, you know. And I say that's a bit flippant. I am super interested in it, which is why I want to talk to guys here. I'm interested to know the science. But if whatever way reality, which is something we can talk about later, because I mean, how you describe what is reality, but whichever way it pans out, it doesn't change what happened to me or this experience that I'm having. So I think people almost get too hung up on that. But just because I've asked on Reddit, and it is one of the questions that everyone wanted to ask you, what is your take on sort of things in terms of entities or consciousness being? Is it all just, you know? Is it in here? Is it some sort of external signal? What would be your sort of blue sky take on it? You can answer as a professional or as a psychonaut.
Yeah, there's these days there's no real line between the two, I think, in terms of the answer I would give. So I'll just give my honest answer. So I think I've never actually tried to explain this, my kind of perspective on this before. So this may not come out very, very clear. But so I think the thing that I'm always struck by is so we usually have this sense of a self, of an ego, of James, some kind of, you know, identity, which you can realize is an abstraction. It's a thought, effectively. You know, in reality, I'm this kind of multicellular organism. I didn't will myself to grow these hands. I have these hands because of a lineage of primates that grasp things, and, you know, everything has this kind of forward momentum of evolution, kind of pushing us into becoming these creatures that we are, which is kind of fully dependent on the context. You know, I have eyes because there's a sun that has light, and there's nothing in me that isn't produced by nature. Basically, I grow out of the, you know, all of us, not just me. We all grow out of the world as features of the world, and so when I think if one's having a psychedelic experience, you can perceive a lot of intelligent activity going on. And my take a lot of the time is what's happening there is the sense of self is dropping away, and you're being confronted with the intelligence of nature, basically. The fact that what you are is a kind of a point in space and time where it's not just this body. I'm not just this body. I'm constantly interacting with my environment. I'm a system that's taking in sensory stuff, and I'm putting out motor action. And, you know, when people reach for saying it's all vibrations, it's all energy, like, the thing they're pointing to is true. There's, if you look at the physics of life, or just understanding the world as a physical thing in general, there are no borders between things. It's all just one system blending into each other. So I think during a psychedelic state, you often are confronted with that, and you're seeing this astounding intelligence that's kind of just bubbling up that you usually take to be you. Like I feel thirsty and I grab a glass and I drink from it. But if I just observe that happening as a reflex, suddenly you're just witnessing the most incredible ripple of activity in reality. And that's astounding that just happens, and everything's like that. Everything we are is like that. All of our perception is just being structured by our brains without us willfully doing it. So a lot of the time, I think that's what's going on. But I'm also aware that so something like the entity encounter experience doesn't seem to fit into that as much. Like that feels, seems to feel very kind of legitimately like, I'm still here. I still feel like I am who I was 10 minutes ago, but now I'm talking to some entity. And so I'm open-minded to the possibility that everything we know is wrong, basically. I would say I'm like 90%, if I had to bet my life on it, I'm like 95% on the camp that it's your brain, and it's the world that we understand through science is basically right. And there's a lot going on in you as a system that produces these incredible conscious experiences. But there's like a 5% part of me that's like, well, right now I could wake up right now and be an insect on Mars that's just like, whoa, I had the craziest dream that I was a human on Earth, and there was this whole history. I knew about the Second World War, and like I could tell, it seemed so real. It was a whole universe. And then my insect partner's like, well, that's a crazy dream, but now let's get on with our life. And it could be that, like, there's no way to rule that out, and you have to kind of understand that could be the case. That could always be the case. So whilst I do think we have good reason to believe the brain is capable of producing these kinds of experiences, I also think that, well, I said we have good reason to believe that. We have good reason to believe that just because we know that the brain produces this experience of a world. You can't directly see an objective reality, but it kind of conjures up this conscious appearance of a world. So we know it's the kind of thing the brain can do. But I think most neuroscientists, if they knew what these experiences were like, a lot of people would turn their attention, their research agenda, into figuring this out, because the kinds of entity encounters people have do not fit into how we think about hallucinations. People are right to be struck by the fact that they seem to be still themselves, still having their internal monologue, and there's something else communicating with them in a space with other activity going on. There's just so much content in these experiences that if it's possible for the brain to run all these different things at the same time, that's astounding. Like no neuroscientist currently knows that that's possible, basically, for you to simultaneously use your language centers to do the talking to yourself that you always do when you're thinking, and simultaneously hallucinate another thing talking to you, and have this visual thing that corresponds to it. Like, so
do you think maybe that it's something, what you were talking there about, sort of this kind of like primordial humanity that's given rise to you in that you had this lineage of ancestors. Do you think that maybe that what this entity situation might be is that this modern firewalled sort of human that we are today is just so far from the primordial stuff that when you take these compounds and those kind of firewalls just break down, and it's kind of, I don't want to get into the sort of trap of like the untapped 90% of human potential, but just even stuff that's been put into the kind of into the archive or into the sort of the recycle bin of consciousness, because we get so walled into our little modern existences. Exactly, yeah. So maybe that's one of the ways it seemed to me, in that it just seems so vast, and the literal awesome when you're there, in that yeah, it's seems like this other realm, and I think that's it's almost like when you talk about like these entities, is it just in your brain? As though it's a disservice to make that seem like the mundane option, like, oh, it's just in the brain. It's like, well, that's incredible then. If the only thing between my conscious experience and transforming pyramids on Mars that is a chemical, then that's even, how did that evolve? What brought that about?
Yeah. Actually, you've just prompted me to think of maybe a better way of saying what I was trying to say at first, which is that so when someone has this experience, they will often say something like, "I couldn't have imagined that. I couldn't have dreamt that up. Right? That's beyond me. Like I couldn't have produced that." And they're right. The I that's the voice in the head, that's the one that's concerned with day-to-day functioning, that's quite mundane, that's like, oh, got to go to the shops, oh, I'm a bit worried about that thing. Like that voice, that isn't capable of producing any of these experiences. But there are whole parts of yourself, like, regions of your mind that never get tapped, like they're because you are not the voice, there's just this whole landscape of other stuff going on underneath that you have no need to tap into. We evolved to survive, and as long as you're surviving, especially in the world, if you live in the West now, there's enough food, and you can have, a lot of people have shelter, that you don't have to, you're not pushed into states where you're going to plumb the depths of what's truly in your mind, right? So I think when people say there's no way I could have come up with that, I think they're right, and that kind of might point to exactly what you're saying, that it's hidden in there somewhere, basically.
But I think that's something that people are also kind of worried to go towards, because that would then suggest there's something that there's this kind of archetypal imagery. I think you use the term sort of dormant imagery, something that's just hard coded into us, so that average Joe like me, I'm sat there, I do my office job, I take these things, and suddenly I'm seeing Illuminati symbols and Egyptians and Inca pyramids. So I suppose that coming back to the sort of scientific point of view, it's like, is there any sort of mechanism as why is it that people are seeing these same kind of things, and this same kind of imagery pops up as if it's hard coded into us? Is there a basis for that you're aware of, or?
So I'm currently have a paper coming out on a kind of, it's a theory of psychedelics and specifically the kind of role of the serotonin 2A receptor, which is the one that tends to be activated by psychedelics. And it's effectively what we're talking about now, which is that there might be some kind of dormant program inside humans, very much in terms of like archetypes, and so I can't talk about it too much until it's published. But one thing I can say is, when you refer to the eye, right, an eye on, like you said, on a pyramid, that to me was actually the fact that eyes and hands are so readily available in these experiences. If you just look at psychedelic art, eyes are everywhere, right?
Yeah.
And the kind of hand of Fatima with the eye on it. I think that's a clue that that this is. If this was some other world, presumably they wouldn't have the things that are most relevant to humans, eyes and hands. Like, these are the two things that we're really, right now, we're looking at each other's eyes, on the screen, and we're these dexterous primates that can kind of use our hands. To me, that's a very strong signal that this is something in the brain that's a kind of an innate program for being a human, basically. And if a fox took, DMT, they would probably go to a world where there were kind of teeth and orange fur, and I think it's more plausible when you consider the eyes and the hands. It's more plausible that this is something, this is a kind of latent program in a human, rather than a universe that happens to have lots of eyes and hands everywhere.
Yeah. The sort of word program, that's something that sort of resonates with me, because that's something that tends to jump out at me whenever I'm having particularly one of these like mystical experiences, which it almost sounds contradictory, but it always comes to me that there's some kind of like truth, or some kind of like the math of the universe seems very clear. Like there's some sort of harmonious code that becomes available for these brief seconds. So Yeah, I'm not sure where I was going that.
But I agree. That's exactly what you'd expect if there was some code that was important for human life. If you were tapping into the program of like, what is life about? It's like eyes are important. Love is important. You know, these are the signals we need to latch onto to survive, basically.
Yeah. So when we talk about mystical experiences, do you put that in a separate kind of category? Is there a sort of a tripping experience and then a mystical experience, or is it always sort of mystical as far as you're concerned?
So when I say mystical, I'm usually just referring to mystical. Maybe isn't well. I'm drawn as people differ on what's the best terminology. In science, they often will say unitive experience because it's an experience of oneness, the thing that I'm talking about. But if you look at the mystics, the classic kind of mystical poets, Rumi and these people, they're talking about the same thing. And so when I use it, I'm talking about just this particular experience where there's no entities involved, and it's more that you have the world as you know it, but then you subtract the sense of being a self, and there's a uniting with the rest of reality. And this is something that's it's found all over the world in yoga, right? Yoga means union because it's based in this Hindu philosophy where you have in the Vedas, in the kind of Hindu scriptures, this idea of Advaita, which is non-duality, which is it's another way of saying unity. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about mystical experience, and that's what I think needs to be defended, because given that the self is a construct, and given that you are a manifestation of an underlying physical world, it totally makes sense to notice that, basically, and that's all the mystical experience is. And when you add in the Buddhist stuff of suffering coming second, and then you can understand why it's a state of bliss and liberation to feel united with the rest of reality. But no entities involved and stuff there, which are harder to explain.
I wanted to come back to something you mentioned earlier, because you were talking about just sort of you were sort of an expression of your ancestors and your sort of lineage and stuff. What is your sort of take on free will there? Is this something you think we have, or are we just sort of as I mentioned, I listen to a lot of Sam Harris's stuff, and he's very sort of resolute on like we do not have free will, and I totally follow his logic there, but I have trouble reconciling that back to, well, hold on, this is me. I chose to do that, didn't I? Sort of things. What's your sort of take there?
This is actually where I'm going next on my channel, because I think I do think it's as simple as saying we don't have free will, and that free will isn't possible in the way that we understand it. The common sense notion of free will, which philosophers would call libertarian free will, which is just where you have complete freedom. I can say I'll move my hand up, and then I'll move it down, and I'll move it left and right. And that what's happening there is that James is deciding, and then James's arm moves, and then that poses a bunch of questions of like, well, how do you get from the mind to the brain to the arm? Like, and that it's pretty conclusive that there's no progress to be made there. You can't make sense of the world that way. Whereas the way I see it is that we are these bottom-up manifestations, as I said before, of lawful underlying reality, and we have this incredible capacity for consciousness. And so what you can to notice that free will is an illusion is it can precipitate the mystical experience that I was talking about before, this kind of sense of, as I'm talking right now, I can actually notice that the words are coming out based purely on the context of you've queued this up, by asking these questions. Now I'm just unloading, kind of what I think, and I don't have to think about what I think. It's just coming out, right? And so as I'm talking, there's this sense in which there's just this witnessing, there's this space of consciousness, and these words are appearing in it. And that's entirely consistent with how we understand the brain to work, that it's, all of my behaviors are the behaviors of a primate that's evolved along this particular lineage, right? I'm not capable of suddenly flying because I didn't, evolve to be a dragonfly, and I'm speaking English because I grew up in England, and there's literally nothing. I'm capable of literally nothing that it wasn't given to me by my context, basically. And it can be. I personally find it really liberating to remember that free will can't be true, because what it means is it's all going to go the way it's going to go. It's, like, even if you did have free will, it's all going to go the way it's going to go. You're going to make the decisions you're going to make. And that's going to be the particular line that happens in this universe. And it will come to an end. And for me, that produces quite a strong sense of, like, oh, wow, like, what a fun little play. Like, I guess I can just watch that play out, and just enjoy the ride. So for me, it produces a very strong sense of there's nothing to kind of ultimately worry about. I was raised Catholic, and that produced a state of kind of a feeling that the universe was ultimately meaningful in a really horrible way, that there's this, like, there are these laws written in the universe, and if you trespass them, you're going to be burnt forever, like this.
So like hardcore Catholic sort of upbringing.
Well, not really so much as my parents were just kind of lip service, but I was an overly conscientious kid. So and from an early age, I was interested. I felt I really had to figure out what was going on in reality. And so when I was handed this metaphysics of there's this God, and he'll, if you're starving on the street and you steal some food, he'll burn you forever. All the other kids just went, whatever. But I was like, sorry, what? Like, that's the most important thing anyone's ever told me. Like, shit, I need to figure this out. And it was actually kind of stressing over that stuff that precipitated my first kind of mystical experience, basically, where I just tied myself in knots so much trying to work through how I could believe in this God that gave me no evidence to believe in it, but it was going to torture me, but it was benevolent. And I just got so stressed that I just stopped thinking. This was about 13 years old. And then I just kind of looked up, and everything was just blissfully tranquil. And without thoughts, it was just apparent that the world is just the world, and it's ultimately fine. It's just, it is the way it is. There's just this kind of isness, this suchness to the world. It's just this, we're here, and you can say whatever you want to say. People go around saying, oh, there's a God, and and like, it's all just words. It's all just thoughts. And so I just had this silent mind experience of just seeing the world, and just this, like, it just broke me open in terms of just this, like, sense of bliss, and like, and that, that was the experience that set me on this path. Basically, it's why I studied psychology. It's why I studied neuroscience, because I was like, why did no one tell me this is the way the world is? Because this is wonderful. Like, people should know the world is this wonderful way, as opposed to this kind of all these other scary ways you can think about the world being.
At what point did psychedelics come into the mix?
So fairly recently, over the last few years, really, with the kind of work I became in. So at this point, I was already a neuroscientist, and my research was very much on how perception is structured. So I became interested in the question of, given that we're just one feature of reality, we're like a wave, how is it that our brains trick us into thinking we're separate? How is it that instead of seeing a forest as just this one, like, imagine like you have these kind of deep ancient forests in, like, Oregon, where the floor is just thick with rotting stuff, and it's very clear that all that rotting stuff becomes the trees, and then they fall down, and it's you can see that it's kind of one thing, and all of reality is that way. But our brains do this thing where we can be like, no, that's an apple, and that's the stem of the apple, and that's a branch. And as soon as you start to ask kind of philosophical questions of, like, well, where does the trunk of a tree end and the roots begin? There's no boundary. You can start to see, like, oh, wait a minute, these are concepts. The brain is doing something strange here, where it's taking this continuous reality, and it's somehow convincing me a trunk exists and a branch exists. And the same is true for us. And I became interested in the neuroscience of how is it that we get so lost, and we get so fearful and trapped in these kind of ego identities that ultimately aren't really real. And then I started reading about the experiments with people having mystical experiences, and that seeming to be the thing that interested me. Was that the research suggested it was the experience that mediated the effect of the. They weren't selling it as you take psilocybin, it does something to your brain, and then you're not afraid of death. It was, you have this insight, and this insight liberates you. And I think in the back of my mind, Buddhism, psychedelics, these things, I was very aware these are related to my kind of core interest. And I think at that point I became aware that people who were interested in psychedelics as well were people who were on a similar wavelength, people who had had similar experiences. I just happened to have mine through kind of extreme stress, basically, rather than through psychedelics at first. And that's what kind of led me into seeing if. So I guess psychedelics for me also represents the possibility to democratize spiritual insights. You know, I don't want to live in a world where you have to put a child through extreme stress through, you know, like in the way that I had to go through in order to have these insights. I'd much rather someone could take off an afternoon. You know, if you're someone who's been lucky enough to have a really pleasant childhood, you live a mundane life, and your main concern is that life feels a bit boring, and then you're in the you're having a midlife crisis. I think that person should absolutely be able to go somewhere where they can take some mushrooms, and then over the course of a few hours have the same insight, which, you know, I believe it to be basically the same insight that I had when I was a teenager. Yeah. And so that, yeah, it's a way of kind of democratizing and spreading these insights, I think.
Yeah, the sort of the thing you mentioned earlier, the kind of the trunk of the tree and the apple and the stalk and stuff. Is that something you think we're capable of changing? Is this just the way we're locked into our sort of the way our brain models reality, which I know it's something else you cover in your channel, is that this what we call reality is actually just a model of reality. It's and then you could sort of make the well, is it any more or less real than the psychedelic experience? What's real? And you can go down that hole. But is there a potential there for change, or are we stuck with this? Or
yeah, no, I think there's huge potential for change. You know, meditation is entirely about this. You can meditation by just paying attention. You can modulate this process. You know, it's only really kept going by our constant distraction, our constant just, you know, going on with our lives and being in a mode of thought where, because ultimately what the brain is doing is it's reducing complexity and trying to reduce this complex forest into symbols. So if I need to say to you, you know, the bird is on the branch, and then you go over to the trunk of the tree and I'm like, no, the branch. Like, the branch isn't really a separate thing, but we now have a way to kind of chunk up reality and point to things and use language, you know, because language is this kind of low resolution symbolic way of talking. So I think these things are actually incredibly vulnerable to, they're not these really rigid, you know, this isn't like a rigid way the brain works and can't be changed, because reality really isn't made of concepts. All you have to do is look at it. If you just pay attention to your breath long enough, and suddenly the boundaries fall away, and you can be struck by like, wow, like, especially, you know, the most profound boundary for most humans is the one between themselves and the world, right? And that's the unit of experience thing. You're like, wow, I thought I was over here and the world was out there. It turns out there's just this conscious appearance. Yeah, and when I say just that, I mean, from our perspective, I still believe in the material world beyond us, but you know, rather than there being a world and a James, and James can see objectively to the world, there's just this space of consciousness. So, and psychedelics are another way to do that.
Yeah. So I kind of wanted to touch a little bit on consciousness and what it is, and also just some like the theories of how do we get this thing that we call consciousness. So again, this is a lot of the questions that came from Reddit is like, is it this just something that emerges from meat? Is, you know, that's sort of camp one, or there's, yeah, is this like a TV signal being beamed into us, and do we exist in some continuum somewhere? But then there's something which I only came across recently. When I first heard it, I kind of railed a bit against it, but the more I've read into it, then the more, I wouldn't say I'm leaning towards it, but the more plausible I find, which is this thing called panpsychism. So I'll just briefly, or maybe you could explain it. You'll probably explain it much better than I could. So I guess could you explain panpsychism, and then perhaps say about where's your leanings into, where is consciousness coming from, or where is it located?
So panpsychism is the idea. Well, an easy way into it in the kind of modern lineage of panpsychist thought is, there's a guy called David Chalmers, who's a philosopher, who coined the term the hard problem of consciousness, which is exactly like what you said. How do you get from meat? How do you get from the brain, from matter, to consciousness, to this mental immaterial stuff. They seem to be two just completely different things. How do you make that leap? And he basically says he tried loads of different models and none of them worked. And he basically came to the conclusion that maybe none of these models are working because there's an assumption here that you have material first and then consciousness emerges. Perhaps consciousness is fundamental. Perhaps it's just in there, in the system. He says, like space and time, like these primitives that you kind of just need to assume to get going with your explanation of the world. So that in modern times, there are other, panpsychism exists in other kind of, systems of thought before the modern Western one. But it's, the idea that, so since then, in the 90s, there have been so many different kinds of panpsychism. There's like cosmopsychism, where like the whole cosmos is like one mind, but which is a bit more like idealism, which is the idea that only consciousness exists. And but if I had to guess, I would say it seems the most common version of panpsychism is one where fundamental particles, like the things that make up atoms, they have consciousness. They have like a unit of consciousness, and then that somehow gets added together in a system like myself to make this bigger unit of consciousness. And that's called the combination problem, which is its own kind of hard problem for panpsychism. And effectively, it's like, I have experience. Experience seems like this strange thing I can't explain. Maybe everything has a little bit of experience and it gets added up, which,
so the kind of, I think like the what it kind of boils down to is, could a rock be conscious? Is the sun conscious? And then that's, so that people rail against that and say, well, that's ridiculous. Of course it's not. But then based on what you kind of said, it's the thing that comes to mind is, well, what would you expect it to do if it was? What would you expect the sun to be talking like something off Mr. Men, like with a big smiley face on it? So when it's, the more I've looked into it, I thought, well, this, like I said, I don't know if I'm leaning towards it, but it's not as absurd as it sounds when you first hear it. It's very kind of like, what? No. But then you kind of get to this point of, well, why not? And it's, again, what would I expect to be different if that was true?
I think it's absolutely like a respectable position to hold in philosophy. And Christoph Koch, who's the collaborator of Francis Crick and all the consciousness stuff, he's a panpsychist and he's a hugely important neuroscientist. So it's definitely a respectable position, although I think people still sometimes think it's a bit taboo. But my personal take on it is that it's basically too defeatist. It's a bit like saying, imagine 100 years ago when people didn't understand life. They didn't understand what it was that made things alive. And if you said, well, this is too hard a problem, maybe it's because everything's a little bit alive, and then all that life gets added up into a living thing, and that's how it works. And they're like, great, we've solved it. I think we're in a similar situation here where I'm like, that's too, like hold up, no need to go so radical over there. We're on the right track with the way we're kind of thinking about it. Because to me, it seems obvious that consciousness is a property of systems like ourselves. It is this appearance of a world around us right now. That's what we're talking about. If we start to speculate if inanimate objects are conscious, you're getting so far from what I consider to be the question, which is, because consciousness is tied up with our senses, right? Like I have visual consciousness, I have auditory consciousness. All my senses are, linked to these conscious experiences. Clearly, that's an important part of it. And if you start saying an atom is conscious, well, where are its sensors? What's what's the analogy here? So I don't think panpsychism is going to turn out to be true, but it is a respectable, and it's an interesting thing to put forward as well.
So what's your, if you had to sort of place a bet one way or another, where would you go?
Well, so I actually have a paper that's currently in the process of being published, where I lay out what I think to be the case, and I'm going to be irritating and say you're not allowed to talk about it until it comes out.
That's fair enough.
But it's very much in the kind of scientific view that there's something about living creatures like ourselves that results in the emergence of this kind of experiential appearance of a world. But that should be out hopefully in a few months or maybe sometime in 2020, and I'd love to come back and talk to you about it.
Yeah, that'd be great. Right, because I'm conscious a little bit of time, so I'll skip on to some of the questions that I got from Reddit, and I'm just going to have to apologise first of all to all the people who got so many questions from Reddit. It was a really good response, and there's just no way we're going to get through all of them. So I'll skip through and try and pick some at random. So yeah, a lot of questions were coming about like the healing properties of psychedelics. I suppose let's think of a way to phrase this. Is it real, or do we think it's real? Is there some actual sort of neurogenesis going on here that these compounds are causing, or is it just a kind of a well-being, a feeling of well-being that makes us think we're better? Like, we kind of brute force our way out of depression just from pure happiness, that kind of thing, or is there something going on?
Yeah, so I think the way to think about it is there's absolutely something going on, but it's best understood not in terms of reductionists, like, these brain chemicals get turned up and down, or these brain areas get more and, grow more. But, if you understand depression to be a kind of a systems level phenomenon, it's to do with, mood itself. Mood is not something that has any kind of intrinsic existence that just like you can be like, here's my mood. And, your mood is a pattern in how you behave, how you think. If you're depressed, you might struggle to get out of bed, you might have negative thoughts. All of those symptoms taken together, they are the depression. There's no extra thing that is the depression. That is the depression. So because that's a mode of behavior, that's being controlled by models in your brain. You have, as a kid, you might build up a model of the world where you're fearful. Say you're in you grow up in an abusive household, and you grow up with kind of PTSD, and you're like always on guard. You might physically be hunched because your brain has to learn, how do I hold this body? And it probably learns, okay, I need to hold it like this, and I need to breathe fast and shallow because I need to be ready to like run away. Like, this is the kind of freeze and flight response, right? And at that point you have PTSD, you're replaying memories and all this stuff is happening. And then with the psychedelics, what seems clear, or, I think it's starting to seem clear, is that they reopen for learning these models. They through chemically, seems through serotonin, through chemically changing the plasticity in the brain, in the same way that as a teenager or as a child, you have what's called a critical period of plasticity for the brain. So the brain has to learn, as I said, how to control your body, how you operate. And when you're a kid, it's far easier to learn a language, to learn a musical instrument, right? Because your brain is ready to take in this information. So if you go back to the example of the person with PTSD, say they're now a 40-year-old man, the abusive situation is far, far gone. Perhaps they're in a good situation in their life. They've got a job, they've got a family, everything's safe, but they're still waking up with nightmares. They're still kind of carrying this tension. They have asthma because of this like clenched, posture. Then if they take MDMA or they take ayahuasca or they take, mushrooms or LSD, this seems to give the brain an opportunity to unlock those models, which is why you'll start to experientially perhaps replay these events, because the model is now basically, you're like running the software effectively. You can't just go in and change the hardware of the computer. You need to run the software. And in doing so, you can then update that model to basically be like, oh, apparently I'm in the Amazon with a bunch of lovely people who are sending me signals that we all just want the best for each other. And, there's this kind of, or perhaps you're in a clinical room with two therapists with an MDMA session, and you're receiving this strong signal of like, I'm safe now, and there's care here. Yeah. Then the brain, when the experience ends, can lock down that and go, oh, I've now learned I'm safe, and you've unlearned the fear, basically. And the same is true of depression. You might unlearn that you need to be in this constantly negative, perhaps you have a negative thought pattern that's driving you down into depression, or you have a fearful thought pattern that leads you to anxiety. All of these conditions seem to have a similar thing where the models in your brain are getting too overly constricted. So the healing seems absolutely 100% real.
That's very sort of similar to my own experience. When I sort of been on retreat and done ayahuasca, And one of like, one of the insights that came to me, and when I tell people about it, it's almost, well, that's not an insight. It's so obvious that it's duh. But I kind of realized just what you described, how tense I'd become just because I was so stressed from work or from situations. And I could almost like feel my body reorganize into a more relaxed state of being. And the message I was getting was just calm down, just slow down, just chill. And it was such a easy, common sense lesson, but you need to kind of hear it in that, like you say, that environment where it's you're open to the message. It's a bit like, when there's somebody who's depressed and it's, oh, well, cheer up, you just need to cheer up, mate. Well, yeah, that doesn't work, but in some context it might do in the context of one of these healings ceremonies. So right, I'll get to another question. You kind of mentioned ayahuasca. Is ayahuasca something that you've done yourself? Have you done ceremonies?
No, I'd be keen to try it, but I've not tried it myself. I think the body load side of it has been enough for me to think it never seems the right time to go and vomit my my lunch up, and I've not bothered yet. But I feel it's almost my like due diligence in kind of talking about this stuff to really know experientially what it's like to go through a ceremony.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your take on it, because I think the difference. I mean, first of all, with the body load, that was a big deal for me to get over. I was so retentive, and when I first was doing ayahuasca, I was absolutely. There's no way I was going to be sick. I was doing everything possible not to be sick, and I just completely ruined the experience. And then when I finally got over it, it was I had these absolutely magical experiences. But the interesting thing where I'd like your take on it, but post once you've done it, is a lot with like your more psychedelics. It's a very it's a conscious experience, and so we tend to associate it with being up here or happening at this sort of head level. With ayahuasca, because of the body load and because there's this seems to be a much stronger emotional core to it as well, and you get people talking about I'm purging out my anxieties. So something's happening here, which has this kind of there's just this kind of much more all over body connection, and it's kind of interesting. It takes psychedelics out of just the headspace into this all over space. So I'd love to hear.
I'm actually, for that reason in particular, I'm really fascinated by it, because I think something that's really missing from modern neuroscience and modern medicine is the understanding that we are fundamentally, first, we're a tube fundamentally. Our body plan is, food goes in one end and it comes out the other, and digestion is what keeps us alive, apart from breathing and stuff. And so fundamentally, we're organized around our stomach, and we're more that than our brains. Our brains and our heads are like these funny little protrusions that come out like a periscope to scan the environment to make sure we can digest safely. So as I described earlier with the kind of fear response, you kind of clench around your stomach and you carry tension in your stomach, with like PTSD and anxiety, and it impacts on digestion. And so many people have like unresolved like IBS and things. They don't know where it's coming from. It can be understood in this context of realizing that we are a full organism. We're not up here. We are this full thing. If we're anything, we're this full organism. And all of your psychology is built around, around protecting and being this like biological organism. And your emotions, are fundamentally ways of regulating digestion and breathing and all these other things. So it totally makes sense to me that unlocking bodily stuff would be crucial to unlocking a lot of psychological content as well.
Mm-hmm. Do you sort of subscribe to the ideas that our sort of microbiome in our stomach is vastly affecting our conscious experience, like more than we would give it credit for, or historically would give it credit for? Do you lean that way?
So I need to look into that stuff more, and the reason I haven't is I suspect I have a terrible microbiome. I think it's basically I suspect there's something there that I really need to personally work on. Mm-hmm. And so that's been on the kind of back burner as like, one day I'm going to really delve into that research and improve my life with it. But from what I've seen, it seems like it definitely seems like there's some two-way communication. You have the number of neurons in your stomach. You have the same number of brain cells effectively as a cat's brain. Like there's this whole second brain effectively in your stomach. that's like semi-autonomous, regulating your digestion and things. So there's a lot going on there that we when we retreat into the mind, and we're brought up to be very kind of rational, like in the head kind of people in the West, and yeah, we definitely need to come back into the body a lot more, I think, for a lot of this healing stuff.
Mm-hmm. I just noticed one of the questions I had here was talking about why do I keep seeing colours and geometry reminiscent of Hindu, Islam imagery and art while tripping on high dose of acid or DMT? And I think, imagine a mosque's colourful interior. I think this is something we covered earlier. You mentioned a lot about the eyes and the hands, and that's when you see these kind of like Islamic mosques, like the absolutely amazing ones. It is sort of like eyes layered together. So I think that hopefully that answers that question from Orgibus. Yeah, the question here. There seems to be a huge love component to psychedelic experiences. Why do you think that particular feeling is so prominent over the others? Yeah, it seems like out of all of our possible emotions, that's the positive one that we bring back. We don't really come back talking about ambition or anything. It's always love. Is there any? Yeah. Why would you think it would lean more that way?
So I think that points to something really important about the kind of nature of reality, basically, which is that when I was talking before about how essentially consciousness is kind of fundamental for what we are, and then fear and ego and all these things are built on top of it, and suffering happens when you engage on that level. What's been known for a long time with meditation, in Buddhism, is when you strip back the thoughts that create the negativity, create the suffering, the emotional tone of consciousness when it's at rest is something like infinite compassion, infinite love. And love has, a lot of different words, a lot of different meanings, for different people. But the idea that at bottom, experientially, our minds consist of awareness, consciousness, and this felt state of love, which you might also describe as a kind of sense of unity or intimacy with everything. If you're just being aware of everything, you are fully coincident with it, you're fully intimate with it. And it's a sense of, love is also this sense of kind of that people who have taken psychedelics will probably know the kind of love I'm talking about, this kind of transpersonal, like it feels just like this is some kind of force in the universe and it's just there to be tapped into. That's
it's like backwards or forwards across time, sort of your ancestors through to your descendants. It's
exactly. And this is what needs to be understood, is that it's scientifically accurate, I'd say, to say that fundamentally the way that we're built is you have this biological creature which, when it's at rest, is in a state of consciousness, awareness, and love. And this state of, because love is this state of love is very related to the concept of home, of feeling safe and at rest, and like I can come to rest now. You think of the love of a parent, like a nurturing love. That's a signaling of safety and home. And so there's one particular feeling, a felt state that you can experience that we call love. But for me, it has all these facets of home, and and it's the kind of north star of our being, really. Like, as these evolved animals, you need to gravitate towards love. You need to know what that feels like, because love is the thing that's going to bind you to your family, to social group. It's going to point you in the direction of maximal flourishing for everybody. And the only reason we don't all exist in a state of constantly wanting to just express abundant love to everyone is fear, right? You have kids are very generally quite loving at first, and then perhaps very early on, they start getting signals, oh, this person isn't safe. I'm going to get hurt if I open up here. And we build up these layers and layers and layers of resistance and fear. And so I think that's what happens, is when you use a psychedelic to change the strength of these models, you're stripping back the fear. And take something like MDMA is very good at this. MDMA doesn't crank up a love signal in your brain. Love is not it's not like you have a shelf of emotions, fear and love and all the other ones, and they're all equals. Love is at the bottom, this set, the way in which I'm using love here, and then everything else is built on top of it. And so you strip those away, and hey presto, infinite love, basically.
So like love is like the substrate then, basically. That's the sub.
I would say it's the basic tone. So consciousness is like it's feeling, effectively. It's the kind of, it's experience, and the emotional dimension of that. The first baseline, the one that's there that you can't get rid of, is what we're calling love, and then that gets obscured. So this is still a picture where love arises through the operation of physical beings like ourselves. It's not something that is an energy force that we tap into, but for beings like ourselves, it's the most important thing. Like as I said, I was raised Christian, and for when Dawkins came out with his book and stuff, I was very much for like, like tell them how stupid they are. They shouldn't have told me all that nonsense. But now I'm effectively, when I look at the New Testament and like I see Jesus as a figure where I'm like, yeah, give me that guy and Buddha. And like everybody on earth should be following those teachings of just like love everybody, maximum compassion, maximum understanding. And I see that because when you look at what humans are as organisms, it makes sense. It's a truly profound insight that's the guiding principle, because of the way that love is fundamental.
Did you hear the recent Sam Harris podcast with Dawkins on it, where they were talking about Dawkins doing psychedelics? It's
really
it was because I'm still a big fan of Dawkins. I know people that he gets a lot of stick for his bluntness of sort of delivery, but I think particularly for that time when he did do the God Delusion, he was he's kind of like a blunt tool dealing with a sort of trying to smash through this kind of like vision of sort of religion. And I think given some of the people he was dealing with, for sort of fair play to him, you can imagine you'd get a bit arsey. But it was funny. So Sam Harris was kind of like pretty much talking him into doing psychedelics, and Dawkins seemed genuinely interested. I thought you meant
he'd done them already.
But he was talking. He was. I don't think he was just paying lip service. And they do a meditation as well. Like Sam Harris talks him through, and so he does actually do that on the show. It's an interesting podcast.
Give it a listen.
Yeah. But that would just be, I think, like amazing to hear somebody like sort of Dawkins have some sort of like holy shit sort of moment.
Well, I often think this of people in the public sphere who are clearly driven by hate or negative emotion or like struggle. So many kind of journalists whose careers are made on Twitter outrage, and I feel like if I'd so love to be in the room when someone like that just had a high dose of mushrooms and came out of the experience, because there's the person they think they are is an invention. We're all these little inventions, we're these coping mechanisms, these stories. And if you strip away that invention and they see what they really are underneath, and they tap into the thing we're talking about, and they get that the whole, if you don't have to struggle against these fears, maximal love and compassion makes total sense. I would just love to see what that's like, and if there's anyone who could actually resist that that experience, or if it would truly transform these people.
Yeah, I think so, because it just that kind of outrage, or that sort of staying up all night on your phone just to sort of banging out that final argument, it just becomes so petty and pointless in the face of these just absolutely sort of transcendent experiences. I mean, I kind of I'm not quite in the camp of like, we need to put psilocybin in the water supply and get everybody but I think it's something people should challenge themselves to do, because it's just such a insightful experience. It's totally rewritten my life. But yeah, I mean, if you do end up doing Ayahuasca, then definitely would have to connect on that.
I've definitely watched a lot of your review videos to see which one I would go to if I do it. So I'll follow whatever you say.
Yeah. I mean, there's a few in Europe. There's one in Spain that I go to. So if you're looking for something close to home, I can definitely recommend one.
Yeah. Great.
Excellent. Well, I'm conscious of your time, James. So I mean, first of all, again, thanks so much for taking the time to do this. It's been fascinating to talk to you, and as I mentioned, I absolutely love what you're doing with your channel. Is there any kind of shout outs you want to give to yourself to sort of bring people closer to your content?
So I guess the main place that I tend to be putting out stuff at the moment is my YouTube channel, which is just YouTube I think .com/Dr James Cooke with an E on the end. It's always got this silent E. And I think you can find me at Dr James Cooke on Twitter, Instagram. I've got a subreddit I've set up now, which is pretty inactive, but feel free to get going if anyone wants to on that. And I would say the YouTube channel is the main place for now. But